Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson on planning scope, Part 3. And now, after having spent so much time talking about the collect requirements process, now finally it's time to talk about the define scope process. As with all of the other processes, it's valuable to start with the primary outputs. And the primary output of define scope is the project scope statement, which has several parts to it. The project scope description, which describes the entire scope of the project in detail. This scope can be progressively elaborated throughout the project, meaning that you will learn more and more details as you go along and add details to your project scope in this process. The project scope statement also includes a list of the deliverables, both product and project deliverables. You should also include your assumptions and constraints and the acceptance criteria so that you know what is required in order for the deliverables to be accepted. You also need to include any project exclusions, anything that was discussed or that you think people might think is in this project, that you need to be very clear and explicit about mentioning and listing those items that are not part of the project. Perhaps the best way to understand the difference between your requirements documentation and your project scope statement is to understand that your requirements may be more than your scope statement. The process of defining the scope involves using the requirements documentation as your starting point and deciding how much of that you're going to take on in this project. Your project scope statement will be smaller than your requirements list, but more detailed. By understanding the purpose of the project scope statement, it makes it much easier to remember that the primary input of the define scope process is the requirements documentation, because that's where all the requirements are that you're going to now narrow down and then detail. As with all of the planning processes, the project charter is a valuable input, as well as the assumption log, which can include assumptions and constraints that can affect the details of your scope. Also, as you're planning scope, you have to follow what's in the scope management plan, so that's an input as well. The risk register, this one might be a little bit of a surprise for you, but the reason it's here as an input is because once you've done your risk planning, you'll have come up with some risk response strategies, specific things, proactive actions that you're going to take in order to minimize risk. These response strategies can include activities that will involve scope, cost, time, and so on. And so those need to be factored in to your overall project scope. There are also, of course, some enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that affect the definition of scope. The enterprise environmental factors that are listed include the organizational culture, infrastructure, personnel administration, and marketplace conditions. You may notice that this is an exact copy and paste of the list that was in the collect requirements process. But just as with the collect requirements process, there may be other enterprise environmental factors that aren't listed here. As before, what about government regulations? Those could definitely affect the details of your scope. Also, you have your operational process assets of policies and procedures for how you should go about defining this scope. There may be some very useful templates as well. Your PMO or program or portfolio may have already come up with templates for the project scope statement. Also, you may be able to find some valuable project files from previous projects in your lessons learned repository. And not only the repository, but your project-specific register may come in handy if, as you're progressively elaborating on this definition of scope, you learn some things and record those. You can use those as inputs to the defined scope process. This is especially applicable if you have a project development lifecycle that is iterative or adaptive, such as an agile process. What are some of the tools and techniques that you can use to define scope? Don't forget the ever-present expert judgment. As with all of your planning processes, expert judgment is something that you should look for and rely on to help you define scope. There may be all sorts of experts and specialists in your organization or industry that can help you in defining the scope of the project. You'll come across all sorts of different ways in which you can satisfy the requirements of the project, and as you do this, you'll need to consider these different alternatives and apply the skill of alternatives analysis. And you'll need to make decisions based on these different alternatives. You'll also need some interpersonal and team skills to help manage all of those involved in helping you to define the scope. For decision making, you may use the same approach of voting or multi-criteria decision analysis that you used for the collect requirements process, or you may come up with something a little different. Although not specifically listed here, you'll certainly have a number of meetings as well, in which you'll have a chance to practice and use your facilitation and negotiation techniques. Product analysis is a uniquely valuable tool for the defined scope process. Unfortunately, the name product analysis doesn't really capture effectively what this tool really is. Product analysis is essentially the process of translating requirements into features. You have all these requirements from collect requirements, and now you need to do the work of figuring out what features will satisfy those requirements. Several different techniques can be used to do this, including product breakdown, in which you break down the product into its components and deliverables and subcomponents and so on, requirements analysis, even systems analysis and systems engineering, or value analysis and value engineering. All of these help you to see the requirements from different angles and can help you to determine at least some ideas on features that you can use to satisfy these requirements. Product analysis can help you to find better and better ways to meet requirements. For example, years ago, when word processors were new, they used to have a feature called a spell checking feature, in which you could have a document in your word processor and you could go up to the menu and select the option to run the spell checker. And that would go through your document and find all of those words that it thinks are misspelled and give you an opportunity to look those up and change them. For years, this was the preferred approach. And then someone at Microsoft asked why. They started asking whether or not there were other ways to meet this requirement. And they came up with the brilliant idea of when you type a word, it immediately checks as you're typing to see whether the word is properly spelled. And if it's not, it'll underline it with a squiggly red line. And that's something that was introduced way back in the 90s and was a much better way of spell checking. If you start asking yourself the why behind these requirements, then you start to look at different ways of meeting those requirements. In this case, the real requirement wasn't to have a spell checker, but rather to have documents that are properly spelled. And the little squiggly line underneath the word was a better way to do this. And now, more recently, we have autocorrect, which fixes it for you as you type. Now, sometimes this doesn't always work, but generally speaking, this is a very good technique for generating documents or messages that are properly spelled. Now, as I'm typing an email, it actually suggests several words that will help me to complete this sentence. And so it's doing more than just spelling, it's actually finishing my sentences. Another product analysis technique is to use user stories, in which you ask who needs this and why do they need it. In fact, there's another technique called the 5 whys, in which whenever someone gives you a requirement, you ask why. And when they tell you why, you ask why again. And you keep peeling back the layers of reasoning by asking why over and over again, sometimes about 5 times. And then you start to get to the real root reason why this requirement is needed. The more deeply you analyze the requirements of your project, the more you'll understand the reasons why, and the more and better solutions you'll be able to come up with to meet those requirements. Another product analysis technique that you can use is to evaluate each requirement and ask yourself whether that requirement expresses a problem or a solution. Most of the time, it's expressing a solution. And by using techniques such as 5 whys, you can get at what the real problem is. And by understanding the problem better, such as the need to have properly spelled documents, you'll be able to look beyond the simple request for a feature such as a spell checker and come up with even better solutions to the problem. This reminds me of an old quote from Edwards Deming, in which he said, "Customer expectations? Nonsense. No customer ever asked for the electric light, the pneumatic tire, the VCR, or the CD." Meaning, of course, that you may not get from the customers any of the really innovative features or solutions, but you'll need to come up with those on your own by understanding better the real need behind what they're asking for. To summarize the define scope process, first take a look at the outputs, focus on the artifacts, and which are the primary or principal artifacts. In this case, it's the project scope statement. That's really the whole point of this process. However, there are some secondary outputs. As you're refining the project scope and coming up with all this additional detail and seeking to understand the reasons behind these requirements, it's quite natural that some of your assumptions or constraints may change, and you'll need to update the assumption log. You may find new requirements or new details on requirements that need to be recorded in the requirements documentation, and that can also affect your requirements traceability matrix. As you meet with all of these people to get more detail about these requirements, it's also very likely that you'll come across some more stakeholders, and you'll need to add them to the stakeholder register. Can you see how, if you understand the purpose of this process and its outputs, it's so much easier to figure out what all the outputs are, or could be? Now let's take a look at the inputs. The main input is the project charter? No. Really, it's the requirements documentation, which is kind of hidden here. But that's the main document that you're going to use, because that's what you're going to review in order to decide what subset of that you're going to use and then elaborate on it. The project charter, though, still provides valuable context and guidance, and the project management plan, specifically the scope management plan, can help you with guidance on how you're going to be defining scope. You can see other interesting inputs here: the assumption log, the risk register. Remember, the risk register is there because of risk responses that may need some scope added to the project in order to implement those risk responses, plus any number of enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Now, finally, take a look at the tools and techniques. As always, expert judgment is there. Again, quite common is alternatives analysis, because you've got a lot of alternatives to consider and you'll need to make a decision on those. So decision making is there, which would include voting as well as multi-criteria decision analysis. You'll also need a lot of interpersonal and team skills as you're working with all of these people. Facilitation is just one of them. And product analysis, which is the process of translating the requirements into specific and individual features and scope, is perhaps the key tool and technique that all of these others support. And this concludes part 3. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.